microphone's fallen off. There we are. Yeah, there we are. Hello, welcome to the latest in our Friday Open Principles lectures. We're very pleased to see you here, and I'm very pleased to be second only to Jenny Murray today in welcoming Sarah Knott to give a talk. So, you know, how cool does that make me feel? Sarah is here to talk about her book, Mother, An Unconventional History, and she has entitled this talk, Mother is a Verb, which is a very good starting point. We discovered when we were talking about this talk that we had a similar undergraduate history degree, although she's much younger than me. But we did both study history at Magdalen. I'm pleased to see John Nightingale, who taught us both here tonight. Sarah is now an associate professor at the Department of History and a research fellow at the Kinsey Institute. And I don't think I can introduce her better than the little note that was sent to me, I think, from Indiana University that says, I'm a British-born feminist, writer and historian, and her underlying curiosity is in how we experience change and how we feel our way through events. I don't think there's a subject more apt for that method and type of curiosity than motherhood. So without more, I'm going to introduce you. Thank you very much, Sarah.
So it's a real pleasure to be here in this setting, and it's one of the things it is a lovely moment for me to express my appreciation for the year that I've been spending here in Mansfield. We have an accessory to this talk. I'm so glad. How perfect. Yes, so to thank Mansfield College for hosting me this year. I've had a wonderful year that included finishing the book that I'm going to be talking about, and also to thank the Rothermere American Institute, which is just next door and has a wonderful relationship with Mansfield College, which I hope will continue and flourish. So this is a book that draws on a history of Britain and North America since the 17th century. It explores worlds such as those of farm servants in Essex, worlds of the Cree and the Ojibwe, worlds of enslaved people in South Carolina, tenement dwellers in Liverpool and Boston, women's liberationists in London. And it's a book that sets out to think about mother as a verb, that is to say, to give a history to mothering as a verb. I think we're used to thinking about mother as a noun, right? Mother as an identity, mother as an occupation, or perhaps motherhood as an ideology, or motherhood as an institution. But I was interested in mother with an ing, with thinking about mothering as a set of activities always undertaken among many other activities. Okay, but that's to get a little bit ahead of myself. So let me ask the question, why? Why a book about the history of pregnancy and birth and being with an infant? My day job is as a historian. I read manuscripts and archives, I read history books and journals, I teach, I lecture, but I've actually come to think about this book as really a creature of the night, and of sleepless nights in particular. The American poet Alicia Ostriker described her night as like a dirty, torn cloth. She was writing in 1976 during the women's liberation movement, and she was thinking about the broken, interrupted nights of new motherhood. Not for her, the usual 8-hour stretch. Now, a full 8 hours, that sounded good to me, but I was up in the middle of the night with a firstborn child. And this book really came from that experience, as well as from the early experiences of pregnancy and the later experiences of a second child. Caught in sleeplessness, holding an infant in the dark, I wanted to know quite simply what it had been like before. Simply put, what did maternity feel like? The reproductive sex or the alternate means, the miscarrying, the sensations of pregnancy, 3rd month, 8 months, then the pleasures of an infant, the drear, the mundanity, the fatigue. Or, to put it in verbs, conceiving, carrying, miscarrying, birthing, and then, with a change in personnel, because not all birth givers become mothers, and not all mothers were birth givers, all those other verbs that we associate with tending an infant, sleeping, not sleeping, holding, caring, using stuff, and so forth. I was actually slightly astonished that I didn't already know these histories. Wasn't I a historian already? And wasn't I a feminist historian? So how to write such a book? Let me quote from a letter from 1878. Baby is stirring, so I must stop. I might notice that these two people up there are slightly distracted. Cue my evidence here. Here's another quotation. The child will stay on my lap and interrupt me so much that I must stop. And there's the challenge. The letters and memoirs to which historians turn to tell us about intimate life often halt when they get to infants. The writing stops altogether, both hands being needed to hold the baby. One letter I read begins with one person's handwriting and ends with another. She was called upstairs, the second person added, or she would not have left off this letter so abruptly. Or there's Anne Livingstone in 1783. Quote, my child calls for my assistance, therefore I must defer writing. So these letters do tell us about one frequent, although not invariable, feature of being with an infant, the experience of being continually interrupted. An insight that told me not only about maternity, this is delightful. This is the first time I've talked about this book actually with an infant on hand, so I'm very grateful to you. That experience of feeling continually interrupted, which told me not only about maternity, but also about how I was going to write the book, or rather what the experience, the condition of writing the book was to be, which is caught in interruption myself. For the rest, in terms of evidence, the research took me into all sorts of corners of the past. To those unusual personal writings, for example, when a person did pick up their pen again. An intimate diary from the 1880s of a middle-class woman, for example, whose first baby was born in a boarding house. Or the 1949 memoir of a jazz-loving, red-headed Manhattanite who gave birth in a city hospital, the laughing gas administered at just that moment the baby was born, when she surely least needed it, and putting her out for 20 minutes. The research also led me to all sorts of other materials where one might read between the lines or off a surface, sources often not formally about pregnancy or about infants, but that revealed something along the way. Handwritten medical recipe books that were handed from mothers to daughters between generations. How-to guides from the 17th century all the way to our present day. So there's a continuous tradition of how-to guides, inventing and reinventing their reformism, whether printed or bound, whether mass-produced, whether read or unread. Midwifery manuals and oral histories with lay midwives of the mid-20th century. 19th century slave narratives, and the interviews with formerly enslaved people that were taken down in the 1930s. Social scientists' interviews with people in 1950s Liverpool or 1960s Nottingham, or social reformers' accounts of factory conditions. And in fact, one of my very favourite early sort of finds was a description in a factory reformer's notebook that described an infant in an egg box suspended above his mother's work spot. Really wonderful hint at factory women's conditions. The letters that new mothers wrote to the US Children's Bureau, or indeed to male experts like Dick Grantley Reed, who promoted so-called natural birth. Early anthropology, composed on Native American reservations in tandem with native storytelling. Or unfamiliar pieces of language that hint at experience. Chin-chucking or firking like a flounder. Very interesting verbs that we don't use anymore. Being great-bellied, or more euphemistically, in the family way, or in a delicate condition. Nidgeting. This is a fantastic verb. Nidgeting, which is an early modern verb for gathering the midwife and your neighbours for your wife's delivery. So nidgeting. Or, alternately, scrounging, which is sharing a bed and not having enough room. Naughty babies, me babies, dowager babies, yard babies, lap babies. All forms of language that suggest experiences sometimes quite divergent to our own. And finally, objects, which have the power to shape what we do. Maternal tools, if you like. A rocking cradle, which keeps a 17th century East Anglian woman in the home, or a cradle board, which lets her Native American counterpart walk and work outside. Or for middle-class 19th century Victorians who thought both sets of these practices were outrageous, the stationary crib and the notions of sleep training that came with it. In all of this research, there were surprises along the way. One was the frequency with which of what we might call dispersed mothering or other mothering, of mothering that is beyond the mother-baby dyad. Looking out from Cincinnati in 1990, the distinguished black feminist Patricia Hill Collins smashed mothers and others into a single verb. She wanted to capture the full-blown mothering of others' children, to honour and to analyse habits of care unrecognised by the mainstream. What surprised me among all of this was finding such practices not just among the African American and British Caribbean communities with lineages into West Africa, but also richly elsewhere. Among the 17th century speakers of Miami in North America, for example, where the term for mother and maternal aunt was the same word, right? A wonderful hint at kind of communal practices of mothering there. Or for the multi-generational families of the Liverpool slums of the 1950s, in which one woman might be called mother, and a new mother, her daughter, might be called mum. Right? So mother and mum differentiating different mothering roles within a single household. So I'd like to read from a section of the book to give you some sense of its flavour and its mode. So I'm going to take us into the 7th chapter, which is called Tears and Anecdotes. And I'm just going to read you from some of the opening pages to see to show what this book is like. So it's chapter 9. Chapter 9, Tears and Anecdotes. I hope this isn't too suggestible to the baby on the balcony. The baby is crying. Great welling cries fill the room. I hold the baby, I pat the baby's back, I pace us back and forth along the corridor by my bedroom. I soothe. The sound ricochets between the narrow walls and soaks into me. After the tactile quiet of pregnancy, there is so much noise. What exactly does an infant's cry sound like? The Dublin writer Anne Enright, charging herself earlier this century with writing a memoir of early motherhood, takes no less than 3 whole pages, to articulate the sound of her baby's cry. H-A-N-A-N-G, she writes. H-A-N-A-N-G. Nang, I've come to think that sounds like. 600 words across 3 pages, 3 full pages, until the cry comes to a full stop. Enright's challenge was to convert sound into text, into a set of letters on the page, into black and white. Her dilemma was what an insistent cry often, but not always does: crowd everything else out. So what has an infant's cry sounded like? It's a banal query. Babies cry. And sometimes, like now, in my life then, they cry a lot. But as it turns out, what an infant cry sounds like cannot be separated from a historical environment. A cry could sound like Scottish bagpipes with their thin, long snuffle for a Californian aunt of 1900, or like a penny horn for a new mother in 1940s Manhattan, or like the red-headed grebe for the 1930s Ojibwa, living on a reservation in their former hunting grounds. The grebe is a feisty, tough bird, about the size of a duck. A baby's pitiful, hard moan might sound just like it. So how a cry sounds depends on what you're used to hearing. Or how a cry sounds depends on ideas about babies. In 17th century England, a clear and loud newborn cry was a welcome sign that the baby was expelling the moisture of the womb, though intensifying crying caused concern. Vehement crying was thought to tax an infant's delicate bones. 50-odd years ago, in the town of Nottingham, many mothers thought that small babies cried simply when they needed something. Others saw babies as willful and cunning, and distinguished between real crying and what they called crafty crying. As one put-upon wife put it, they get very crafty, and if they know, this kills me. They get very crafty, and if they know you're going to keep running up and down the stairs, they do it all the more, and then they stop and laugh at you. Sort of poignant and funny all in the same. Or a cry depends on ideas about pain. For much of the 18th and early 19th centuries, the consensus among Western doctors was that infants were exquisitely sensitive to pain. But that changed in the 1870s, with many scientists and clinicians claiming that infants were almost totally insensible to pain. That idea was only fully debunked in the 1980s. Did infant caregivers really believe it? Or a cry is more than just a sound. An irritating cry among 18th century letter writers, a spine-destroying cry in one early 20th century account. So crying can have a kind of bodily quality that leaps over the neat boundary between the care and the baby, and that pushes and pulls at the hard and fast division of the senses into 5. A cry can be felt as more than just sound. It can touch. Or a cry can be a sound worrisomely out of place. One Englishwoman was brought before a church court in 1620 Nottingham for bringing a most unquiet child to the church, to the great offence of the whole congregation. The vicar, it was reported, could not be heard for the offensive noise. An enslaved southern father kept a bottle of sweetened water in his shirt to keep warm, to give the baby when it cried. Laura Clark recalled that when she was a slave child on an Alabama plantation, enslaved women regularly gave children sweets to keep us quiet. In a Louisville, Kentucky jail before the Civil War, Angie King walked her baby all night to keep a drunk white woman from carrying out the threat of bashing its brains in. King produced her free papers the next day to prove to her jailers that her husband had brought her freedom from slavery. In the former quiet of the corridor by my room, the baby's cry is a refrain, a song without verses, a sermon without words. I listen, I interpret, I comfort, I place the sound in history. Thin bagpipes, a grebe's moan, chut-nang. The crying sounds raw, something innate spilling forth. At the same time, the sound attests that what seems natural is only known through culture. Nature and culture can be different terms for the same thing. No sound can be heard, discerned, made sense of outside our historical circumstances, outside the particularities and specificities of time and place and individual. I find the thought comforting, a refusal of false universals. And I also wish the crying would stop, that we knew how to return him more easily comforted to his own strength. My godmothers, Margaret and Betty, retired London nurses, and fierce stalwarts of the 20th century medical profession, they say it does a baby good to cry. But I don't think that. And let me read you one other short section. This evening, Kay has the radio on and is getting things ready for the baby's bath. The white noise should prevent any conversation waking the firstborn. Did you know, I say, leaning in the doorframe, that when the British psychoanalyst Donald Winnicott was doing the first radio programmes about mothering, back in the 1940s, that listeners initially thought he was a woman. His high, reedy voice sounded female. Perhaps how Winnicott talked about infant care helped. Unlike so many male experts before and since, he clearly liked and trusted mothers. On the radio tonight, there's discussion of a memoir by a Canadian trans man who nurses his own baby and works as a lactation consultant. Having a baby is such a moving target. Think of all the changes in our 21st century, the new figures and styles on the social landscape, the trans man in Winnipeg, queer families with an infant, new fathers staying at home, egalitarian mothering among working parents. Or think of the rolling back of health services and state support and the low value assigned caregiving under capitalism. Kay nods and agrees, preoccupied with watching the baby's torso. His New York accent bounces lightly against my English tones, another half conversation in a stream of half conversations. Historical curiosity lets us fly, I am reckoning, allows us to get free of ourselves, to doubt and to reimagine, to own more fully our own times, discerning in the contours of what they are or might become. The past can burden us, or the past can release. So the book that I ended up writing, as you can hear, is written in a first-person voice. It's full of short scenes, It's replete with interruptions. I wanted to create a kind of trellis of anecdotes, a series of juxtaposing fragments about a set of verbs. This was a way to pluralise and to specify, to borrow a beautiful and succinct phrase from each Sevage. I wanted to make interpretation via juxtaposition and contrast and connection and accumulation. I loved and love contemporary maternal memoirs, writers like Rachel Cusk or Anne Enright, who I quoted, or Maggie Nelson. Their documentation of small experiences make maternity feel bigger. In writing in this way, I found both recognition and unfamiliarity in the experiences of people in the past, both empathy and distance, both similarity and contrast. If there's one argument, one main thread, if you like, that runs through the book, it's that pregnancy and birth and being with an infant may sometimes seem universal or transhistorical, but that these visceral experiences are richly various. Mothering is more plastic, more up for grabs than we might expect. The past is both more like us and more unlike us than we may expect. And I think that's what history can do for us sometimes. It can give us new words in the way that poetry does. It can give us unanticipated solidarities, radical alterities, unexpected precisions, and distinctive understandings for ourselves. Thank you. Can I use them as well?
Thank you, Sarah. That was... Ooh, well.
Yes.
Microphone working. Yes, I'm on. Thank you. That was sorry. That was really very interesting. I wondered if whether, when you'd written this book, you ended up feeling more universal or less universal than you had initially done about those visceral experiences of mothering.
More or less. Well, I'm a historian by training, so deep embedded in me is the contingency of anyone's experience.
Yeah.
So actually, I think because of that, it expanded that sense of contingency. Especially because I was living through an experience about which people like to make universal declarations. Right? All mothers love their children. It's always been like this. So I felt as if I was surrounded actually by a universalising world, and that my instinct as a historian was to suggest otherwise, and what I discovered in the archives only confirmed that, only extended that actually.
Yeah. I asked because you draw on psychoanalysis and you talk about this idea of mothering being an intrinsically interrupted, anecdotal, patchy thing, and I just wondered whether that was something that you thought actually was intrinsic to the process or the doing of mothering.
So I don't, in the end, argue that interruption is intrinsic to maternity. So there's a wonderful maternal theorist at Birkbeck in London called Lisa Baretza, and she suggests that interruption is the fundamental condition of maternity. And in fact, she makes an argument that if so, the way in which we should interpret maternity is through anecdote rather than narrative, right? The child is continually breaking maternal narrative and creating only anecdotes. And I find that incredibly provocative and very resonant with my own experience. But I think if you go back to other parts of the past and you look to more communal forms of mothering, that notion that the interruption is absolutely intrinsic starts to break down. So yes, we find it in these wonderful interrupted letters and diaries, but no, we don't necessarily find it in native storytelling, for example, right, where the practices are shared, and in which a baby is being handed round in a way that it seems to me dispels that sense of absorption and interruption that is so characteristic of contemporary middle-class mothering.
Okay, right. Now, I'm not going to hog the question and answer much as I'd like to, because that's not fair. So who is going to ask the first question or make the first observation here? So there's a hand just there. Yeah.
Hi.
Hello.
I've been reading your book along with Sophie Lewis's book, Full Surrogacy Now, feminism after family. And one of the words that Sophie refuses to use is mother. And instead she calls us, them, gestational laborers, to really get at a kind of critique of the gendered labor that reproduction requires. So I was very interested by what you said about how, history is bound up in language and in the invention of words, but I also want to ask about the elimination of words.
Yes.
So why retain the word mother?
Yes.
And is there a sort of political benefit to eliminating it in favor of something else? Not necessarily gestational laborers, but
which is a very
something
clinical
else.
term, isn't it?
Yes, it is. Yes, it is.
It's hard to imagine people actually wanting to sign up for that in some ways, right? Beyond the political point that it's making. So I don't have a settled answer to that. I look around and I see so much linguistic innovation coming out of the trans community, right? That I find really exciting, right? So the trans man in Winnipeg who I referred to talks about chest feeding, right? So complete moment of linguistic innovation there. And I think the jury is still out about whether those labours that have been traditionally associated with maternity will retain a language of maternity or not. And I don't think I have a position about it. In fact, I'm not even sure that I'm the person to make that call. I did write an op-ed piece recently that actually made a pitch for thinking about mother as a verb and allowing a certain detachment from female bodies or female identities in consequence, right? And suggested that, in fact, what we need is a kind of new maternalism that would be gender flexible. That is to say, so we have maternalism as a movement that's about promoting progress on the basis of maternal identity, right? And that's late 19th century onwards. You see these political movements that are in which the authority of a mother is being used to back certain political positions, right? So black mothers being used to critique racial police violence in the United States today, maternalism. And so what the pitch of the piece was to say, what we need is a maternalism that is focused on the verb and that would be a coalition of caregivers of all kinds, right? And you can think about how plural that position is. It's not just gender plural, it's also the gap between, or a coalition between birth givers and adoptive parents, right? Queer families, new fathers, people who work in childcare, right? These are all ways in which we might want to pull and push at mother when we think about it as a verb. So the book you mentioned is on my list and I'm kind of curious about it.
Well, she'll be here on
She'll
the
be
24th.
of this month.
I'm hosting her at Worcester.
So 24th of May, Worcester College, this is Merve Emre. Now we can all go. Yeah.
Excellent. Interesting. So you don't have a political position because you could say actually talking about mothering is intrinsically gendered and you should talk about parenting or child caring or some other thing.
It seems to me that we're at a moment of breathtakingly new trans visibility, right? So last month was a fascinating trans filmmaker who was in town discussing his film that's called A New Deal with the Universe. It's about his pregnancy and about becoming a father. It's a breathtaking film and it's newly on national release. I got to talk to him afterwards and he said about gender, I don't know about gender anymore. It was fascinating. He said, gender for me really mattered in the 1990s when I transitioned. It was all about the flirt. And now here I am, and I'm this child's father, and I don't have anything to say about gender anymore. So for him, the question of gender, its definition, what we should want it to be politically was very, very unsettled. There's a second similar film called Seahorse, which I have not seen, which does debuted in New York by a trans man called Freddie McDougall. So here we are at this amazing cultural moment, in which I think is an unsettled and productive moment. And as a historian, my instinct is to say, it's to kind of lean right back and watch how it unfolds. Right? On the other hand, the other thing I would want to put alongside that is the term mother has come clad with such misogyny over so many centuries. Right? If you think about terms like 19th century terms like mothersome, right, which basically means fussing too much. or many other kind of adjectives that we associate with maternity, they come with a misogynist sneer almost invariably. And so I'm worried about giving up the feminist critique of that misogyny even as we loosen the relationship between mother and gender. Right? It seems to me there are losses as well as gains in this moment. And so there's a sort of need for an alertness, political alertness there. I'm wondering if Sophie Lewis delves into that particular question, right, about what happens to what we do about misogyny that's attached to maternity.
I have an answer to that. I mean, her argument would be that one of the aims of calling them gestational laborers is actually to look toward a kind of gender abolitionist politics that makes the work more visible than gender itself. And she's sort of writing in the tradition of people like Donna Haraway.
Great. So I guess we're fellow travelling in that emphasis on mothering as work, right? There's real resonance between my historical analysis and that position, I think.
And here.
I was just going to add and play a bit of sort of, just what you, if you hadn't said about the misogyny, that was what I was going to add, but also to say that we're in a moment of profound attack on the women who have been doing care work, particularly in this country, due to austerity. And so there is an additional, as well as the language that we use, there's an additional sort of very concrete political agenda in supporting those predominantly women who are doing that caregiving. And I think there is a real risk of losing that. And there's a risk in turning it all into labour, which looks at it in very much economic language. And to think again about some of those critiques around care not being, how do we express it as a form of work that doesn't involve you in valorising work in a capitalist environment?
Yeah.
So I think that just poses another question, but I would really want to hold on to that.
So part of what was very illuminating for me in looking back at the past was to think about who has done the mothering and to notice the ways in which inequity makes mothering fraught, right? So the best historical example of that would be the figure of the wet nurse, right, who is both mother and servant, right, and who has a shifting relationship to her employer based on changing privileged notions of what mothering is supposed to be, right? So a 17th century wet nurse would have brought her employer's baby into her own home and tended it independently, right? And then come the rise of sentimental notions of motherhood that are all about tenderness and attachment, the wet nurse moves into the home of the 19th century middle-class mother, right? Leaving her own child behind. So that speaks to that question of both labour and, I think, inequality, right, which ought to be in the mix when we think about caregiving in the present day and in the past.
How far, and I know that you take certain periods and certain types of motherhood as your comparators. You're not trying to do a comparative history of all maternal experiences. But how far do you think you can get to some of the more communal experiences or experiences in pre-literate societies or societies that don't write about these things? I know one of the difficulties is that people haven't written very much about motherhood. That's one of the points you make. But
so I'm an early American historian by training, so I worked in my first book in the 18th century, and the book that I've written goes from sort of the 17th century through to the close of the 20th century. So there's plenty of fodder in that terrain for examples of communal mothering and quite a variety of examples of communal mothering. So it's not easy to get at the most intimate practices of Native American life across time, but we inherit very robust traditions of Native American storytelling. We inherit Native American languages, which are very revealing of kin relations and experience, right? One particular verb for the action of swinging a cradle board on your back, for example, right? These kinds of languages that tell us about past practices. So we have that body of material, which is quite robust, next to the very compromised but nonetheless useful accounts of early anthropologists going into Native reservations and interviewing Native Americans from different nations on their ritual practices in their everyday lives. So that's one body of material. We have another body of material that comes out of the slave narrative of the 19th century, and then out of the WPA narratives of the 1930s, in which we have a rich body of historical material that is about life under slavery, and that refers back to West African traditions. And then we have sociological fascination in this country with the working class family, in which there were communalist and intergenerational modes of mothering. Now, all of those sources are compromised, right? None of those are not the kind of sources that are direct in any sense, but you can read them creatively and critically and between the lines to try and get at a view of maternity that doesn't assume that it's the be-all and end-all and the absorptive, individualistic occupation, right? Yeah.
Hi, thanks Sarah very much for your interesting talk. I'm actually very impressed you can take a step back from a crying child and think about writing a book when I reflect on my own early years with small infants. But one of the things that I've just been thinking about as I'm sitting here is I have two children, one born who was immediately with me, and my second child who was not. He was 3 months in hospital. And to mother in that circumstance, it's really interesting. I haven't read your book yet, so I don't know if you talk about bonding and that kind of creation of a bond. And I mothered my son, who's my second child, with lots and lots of other people for 3.5 months. And I never knew who that person was going to be from day to day. There was a different nurse rotated on every day and every night. And at the time, I thought a lot about it. And I've always wanted to try and write something about that very kind of... it was a very necessary experience, and I valued it hugely because I had help in that mothering role there, and I couldn't have done it without them. And I also thought that as a sole mother with my daughter, you're very alone in that process and very kind of as if everyone should know how to do it, and you don't. And you just sort of make it up from day to day. So I had help with my son, obviously, but at the same time, the whole to mother was complex. And I had a sort of shared role for all that time with everyone. Their investment in him was to get him well, and mine was to try and get to know him in that environment. I'm not quite sure I've got a question exactly, but I just wonder if you touched on bonding, or whether your book focuses on the infancy years.
So I can pick up the isolation that you ask about, and about the question about bonding and who's in the room, right? So that sense of isolation, which was women liberationists, one of their key critiques of the experience of motherhood was the sense of isolation, right? Which is a modern condition in many ways, a modern dilemma, sort of produced by nuclear family and long workplace hours, and there's a number of factors that go into that sense of isolation that's absolutely commonplace in for example, the interviews that Anne Oakley, the feminist sociologist, carried out in the 1970s when she was really interested in trying to excavate these experiences that had sort of gone under the radar. And isolation is one of the key themes that comes out for those women in 1970s London. What I find so interesting about the question of attachment is I think that there is a contemporary consensus that attachment and bonding is at the centre of maternity, right? And what I'm struck by in terms of an intellectual history is the extent to which we inherit now a tradition that has never been able to notice that there are often other people in the room, right? So that the analyses that we inherit about attachment really presume mother, baby. It's the dyad, you know. And I speak to this about this with my colleagues in the Kinsey Institute quite often, because there's a whole science now about how oxytocin works, which presumes that oxytocin is, you know, it's about a mother and an infant. And I said, so who are the mothers? Are we talking about white mothers, black? I mean, I asked the kinds of questions a historian would ask, and those aren't in the room for my Kinsey scientist colleagues. But also, so what about the oxytocin levels of other figures, other caregivers? What do we know about that? And the answer right now is we don't know anything. So part of what's interesting about what's happening with trans is sort of forcing certain intellectual questions onto the agenda that weren't there before, including gender itself. And I do think the possibility is that it will pluralise our sense of how attachment works, what it is, in a way that may take some of the pressure off the expectations around sort of foundation parents, primary parents, exclusive caregiving, all that constellation that has really raised the stakes of how women behave in the first months after childbirth. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Thanks for your talk. It's a fascinating talk. I was wondering about the genre of historical material that you're using, because I think you're using mostly life writing sources. Have you extended your analysis into legal records or economic records and how they would reflect mothering and the experience of mothering?
Right, so the life writing records are often the most rich, right, and wonderful. One gets to sort of walk into a life in certain ways in life writing. But in fact, the majority of the materials that I use in the book, because I didn't want to centre on white middle class women, they're not life writing sources. So it is trying to read history off objects like cradle boards or cots or cradles. It is trying to read between the lines of interviews with formerly enslaved people that weren't, in fact, in any formal sense about what were your experiences of maternity. It is trying to read between the lines of accounts of the breakdown of the working class family in the 1950s. So I found myself wanting the life writing sources, not finding them, and having to be very creative about where else I looked. And in fact, the solution for me was to sort of embrace an anecdotal method of analysis, right? So that I put the anecdote as a data point, if you like, or the fragment as a data point at the very centre of how I wrote the book.
So as a medievalist,
Yes.
I use legal material,
Yes.
and midwives feature in medieval legal records,
Yes.
often as a method of keeping time, because the midwife will testify that they were there at the birth of a child, and that's, for women, one of the ways that they narrate sort of timekeeping in the legal records. They can swear that it was
Yes.
at such and such a time because the midwife was there and was present at the birth.
Right, and that 1620 anecdote about the baby crying in church, it's from a legal record.
Yeah.
So yes, I'm very grateful to my legal historian colleagues for paving the way, right, for generating those kinds of material.
I should say, in terms of material culture, I think maybe one of my favourite chapters in this book is the one called Damp Cloth, which is about all the different kinds of nappies and cleaning materials and things that people use. And the story about terry toweling. I can't remember where the factories are, that women used to take the toweling that was used for cleaning
Yes.
machines in factories.
Yeah.
That sort of terry toweling you think of as a baby grow being made out of, and
So
take it home because it was better for cleaning your baby and use something else to clean the
I
machines.
think it's Lancashire
Yeah.
factory women who would take those cloths home and use something, absolutely.
Mm.
I mean, I never thought I would write a book that had the word nappy in it. I remained slightly astounded by that. But that particular chapter tries to, it sort of thinks about, can you give a history to the experience of sitting still and nursing and having damp cloth, being surrounded by damp cloth and the smell of damp cloth? Can you give a history to that experience? And it tells the story, as it were, of an 1880s woman in Victorian Glasgow, right? And the smell of cloth, her smell, the kind of caustic smell of 1880s soap, right? So in fact, the domestic servant working in the nursery, this is the moment when the nursery emerges in the urban middle class home. So it sort of explores that notion of damp cloth for that woman, for her sensory experiences, and then it switches to a scene of a midwife and laundress in Alabama in the same decade, and thinks about what a comparable action would have been for a woman called Caroline Bowers, who had her first child, first generation outside of slavery. Her mother was a midwife under slavery and had 5 children. Caroline chooses to have 1. She can do that because she's not under the same reproductive duress. And so it sort of explores that same question about what is it to sit still and smell damp cloth? What is the expertise that we have? One area of lost expertise is the language of cloth that was so important to our predecessors, right? And that has dropped away in favour of a consumerist language of colour and thread counts. Very different to a 19th century language of cloth, which was a realm of extraordinary female expertise. So I found, in the end, as you can hear, I very much reconcile myself to writing a chapter that was called Damp Cloth, even though I was slightly horrified as I began it to think, well, was I going to be a historian whose colleagues along the corridor thought was a little strange?
But isn't that the point, that visceral things don't get written down? And so if you try to identify, well, how much of this is universal, how much is contingent, you can't do it unless you look at things like that too.
Yeah, and material culture is a really extraordinarily rich way into human experience and to women's experience in particular, I think.
Hi, I really enjoyed your talk. I thought it was really interesting. And in regards to the cloth and the sort of materiality of being a mother, I was just sort of thinking about how things are like for young women such as myself, when there is this growing expectation that if you are to have a child, you have to have all these material things, you know, extortionately priced prams, like the equipment, the clothes. It just seems so expensive, and with the rise of things like mummy blogging, where you know, predominantly white middle-class women are sort of exposing their experiences of motherhood online, and it just sort of seems like an insurmountable task. And for certain groups of women, like having a child has become more and more delayed, because you have to think like, I need to have all of these things if I am to be a good mother. Because obviously I don't know whether you touch on ideas of being a bad mother, but I just kind of wanted to ask you whether you kind of looked into kind of wealth and like sort of status and ideas of bad mothering, and this belief that like you had to do certain things, and like expositions of motherhood in the way that mummy bloggers try to do.
So there's a wonderful history of the commodification of motherhood, right, which precedes exactly the observation that you're making, and I think Instagram is its latest iteration. Right, extraordinary visual representation of a highly commodified form of maternity that, as you say, kind of makes stuff the barometer of good parenting, which is really a nonsense. And then the question about social status, I mean, it seems to me that the ideology of good motherhood has always trailed in its wake notions of bad mothers, right? Which may have been the majority of mothers most of the time, right? So if we go back to one 19th century example, that figure of the Victorian sentimental mother, right? White, selfless, devoted, married to someone who can create economic independency. She's not the 1%, but she might be the 20%, right? And the Irish midwife who comes and works in her household is not a good mother by that contemporary ideology as held by white elites, right? And the immigrants across the city, I'm thinking of Chicago in particular now, they're also not good mothers because they don't follow the prescriptions of a long-standing American maternity. So I mean, there's a very good feminist scholarship about changing ideologies of motherhood and who was excluded from them, that I was very, that I've used a great deal in teaching. And in fact, in writing about mothers of Verb, in some ways I wanted to sort of put that to one side, to put the patriarchal story to one side, and to put the ideological story to one side, and actually just try and see if I could excavate a history of actual much smaller scale experiences, some of which may not have been completely predicted by that ideological history, right? That flew under the radar, that had some kind of independence from those stories of ideology or commodification. So, yeah.
Do you think like children's perspectives can give a good insight into motherhood? Like I'm thinking of autobiographies like Margaret Forster, where they try and like recreate their mother's subjectivity through like a feminist perspective. Do you think that's useful?
I think it's absolutely useful, and there's a wonderful scholarship out there on the history of childhood that really tries to centre children as historical actors. And I read in that scholarship to plunder, but not in order to bring children into my work as independent actors. That is to say that when I set out to write this book, I really wanted to centre the experiences of the adults doing the work. And I felt increasingly strongly about it the more I spoke about the book, and the more frequent the invitation came to take into account everybody else, including a colleague who said to me, senior male colleague, who said to me of my partner, "I hope Kay gets his just due," which was very much a comment on the equal parenting that enabled me to write this book at all, right? But which got my back right up. I didn't feel like it was my responsibility to write a history of fathering, and so I became increasingly resistant actually to invitations to actually write the history of parenting, or actually write the history of fathering, or actually approach things from a child's perspective. And I really wanted to centre the account on the adult women who, in fact, for most of the history that I study, were doing the labour.
So it really is, you've made a specific choice that it isn't a book about parenting or child caring, to come back to this question about gender roles, traditional gender roles, and how these are being changed now and have changed through time. That was a specific choice you made. This was the angle you were taking.
Yes, I saw that as a feminist act, to continue to centre the female labour that is in fact the history of childcare. Seemed to me a feminist act. At the same time, what I wanted to notice was that mothering was up for grabs now, and I wanted to do those two things together. Some of that is to do with the particular kind of maternity I was historicising, right? So I was talking about pregnancy and birthing and being with an infant, right? So that's a different historical subject than thinking about the parenting of older children or of adolescents, right? I mean, I think there's a stronger argument to make there about switching to a history of parenthood, say. But for those experiences, until almost yesterday, the identity of birth givers was female. In fact, I think we could arguably switch it and say that mothers were women, not women were mothers, right? That may have been the defining identity, was just someone who was reproductive, not someone who was gendered woman. And I kind of wanted, as a historian, to really notice and give weight to that very long history in a way that was confident and embraced the different possibilities in a 2019.
On that point, I was wondering whether you thought that, like...
Sorry, could you move the mic a little bit closer?
Yeah, sorry. On that point, I was just wondering whether you thought that kind of mothering was an intrinsic part of kind of the way that women conceive of themselves, whether, in the modern world, people make the decision not to have children, and that's kind of making a statement about your identity in relation to mothering, and kind of what does your book say about the identity part of the labour?
It seems to me that more or less until the women's liberation movement, there was an utter fit between femininity and maternity, and that the great cultural achievement of the women's liberation movement in the 1970s was to separate out femininity and maternity. And I think that analytically and culturally, that has been largely to the benefit of femininity. That is to say that we have a massive scholarship that has thought very, very hard about gender and has thought very hard about femininity, and has somewhat overlooked, I think, maternity. That means that in our present day, as inheritors of that clear separation, it's not difficult, right, for us to grasp the contrast between femininity and maternity. It means that it's hard for us to reapproach the history before the 1970s in which those were more or less the same thing. It makes it hard for us to think back into before the happy voluntarism of our own day, however compromised it is, right? And to really grapple with the extent to which reproduction was women's burden and maternity was synonymous with femininity.
Any more? I'm conscious I want to give Sarah a chance to sign some books and have a drink before dinner. But if anyone else has a burning question they want to ask now, they can. Otherwise, I'll bring it to a close here. I have been told off in the past by my husband, who's an academic, if I say a book is interesting. He says it sounds mealy-mouthed. It's not mealy-mouthed. This is a really very interesting book. I really enjoyed reading it. And I think it's a sort of genre-busting book. It's a professional historian's book. but the way that the voices are woven in is like some of the best of fiction. I'm thinking of Lincoln and the Bardo and the voices, the way the voices in that book read. It's a great book. It was a fantastic talk. Thank you very much for coming to speak to us, Sarah.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Sarah will be around outside signing some books, chatting for a bit after this. Next week, we continue our series at 5:30 next Friday. It's going to be Marianne Seacart, who's a very well-known journalist, is writing a book about women and authority and power. She's currently a visitor at All Souls. And that will be next week's talk, so do come along if you want to. And spread the word. Thank you very much. Bye.